Thank you, Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. I think most of us have heard the saying, right? Never assume. Because when you assume, you make a bleep out of you and me. But even though we know this saying pretty well, I feel like we've forgotten it a lot in today's world. That we'll make assumptions about what people are thinking and what their intentions are, and that's causing friction in a lot of social interactions, sometimes anger. It's important to remember this lesson that you should never assume. In fact, it's important enough that at my workplace, they actually have a formal class called Collaborate Training to remind you of this. One of the units is to not assume what other people's intentions are. So today I'd like to take both a serious but then a little bit of a humorous look at where assumptions can make you go wrong. And in particular, I'm going to talk about 3 different types of assumptions. 1, assumptions about language. 2, assumptions about appearance. And 3, assumptions about intention. Number 1, assumptions about language. We can find out when you're talking to people that are little kids especially, that there might be some assumptions about language that throw you off. I remember one time, when I was a little kid, and my parents and I went to McDonald's, and they thought that, hey, you know what, Albert is probably old enough to pay for the meal, to go up and pay for the meal and order and get us our food. I don't remember how old I was at the time. I do remember that my head was maybe slightly above where the level of the McDonald's counter was. So I walked up to the counter and waited for somebody to come up to me, and then she did and said, "Have you been helped?" And I didn't really know what that meant. Have you been helped? I interpreted it as, do you want help? And then so I said, yes. And she said, okay. And then she walked away. And I was like, well, I wanted help. Why didn't you give me help? And then so I was standing there for a little bit, and then another server came over to me, and then she said, oh, excuse me, little boy, have you been helped? Yes? Because I thought she was asking, do you want help? And then she said, oh, okay. And then she walked away, and I thought I didn't know what was going on. And then I remember starting crying, because here I had like actually a fistful of money. Nobody was coming to help me. And then finally a different server came over, and she said, oh, can I take your order? And I said, yes, yes. And I was able to make my order. So here's an example of, I just didn't understand, and they didn't understand that maybe I didn't know what the word "have I been helped" meant. Caused a little bit of friction here. Let's fast forward a number of years to when I started at work. In fact, this is my first week at work. There's a lot of technical terminology in an industrial environment that you don't necessarily run into in school. And one of the things that I did, my mentor was teaching me how to do a project involving a 55-gallon drum. There are certain technical terms that you use with 55-gallon drums. Number 1 is you might be using a piping component that you screw in, and that component, for whatever reason, is referred to as a nipple. Second thing about a drum, there's a hole in the top where you fill in the 55-gallon drum. For those of you who are not familiar, the technical terminology for that hole in the drum is actually a bung hole. And I remember I didn't know any of this terminology. The first week of work, my mentor was walking me through this project, said, okay, we're going to need to put a pump on this drum. So at some point you're going to need to put a nipple in the bung hole. And I said, oh, we're doing what? You can do that. I'm not going to be doing any of that. I don't know what you're talking about. And it took a little while for me to understand what his terminology was. Caused a little bit of confusion, a little bit of friction. I didn't want to put my nipple in any bung hole, for sure. So that's assumptions about language. Next thing is assumptions about appearance. Some of you may have heard my story before when I was vacationing in Rome, that I was near the Colosseum, and then I usually don't like to take selfies. I give my camera to other people usually to take pictures. So I usually try to figure out how to ask them to take a picture in another language. Saw some Chinese language speakers. I'm like, great, you know, when I want a picture taken, I'll get one of them, and I know how to say that in Chinese. I saw these two young women at one point when I was ready to take a picture, and then I said, oh, great, okay. Held out my camera and said, 可不可以帮我照相? They looked at each other, looked back at me, and one of them said, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just said. And then I said, oh, you're not with that Chinese tour group that was here? No, no, we're from Canada. Oh, okay, sorry, so I made an assumption there. Similarly, I made an assumption when I was vacationing in Tokyo, and I was trying to ask a question that I wouldn't be able to phrase in whatever elementary Japanese I taught myself. And then I saw some people who weren't Asian, like, great, I ran up to them, maybe they can help me out with this question. And I asked them my question, but I assumed they were American, which they were not, they were German. And they luckily knew enough English to tell me, slow down, what did you just say? We couldn't understand you, we can help, but you were speaking kind of quickly there. And so I thought, oh, okay, here I've got myself into trouble because I thought these people were American. I made an assumption. So we covered assumptions about language, assumptions about appearance. Finally, let's close off with at least one example of assumptions about intention. There was one time I was a student in high school, and I forget what it was I did, but I did something wrong. And I did something this way, and I knew I should have done it that way. And I knew my mom was going to give me a lecture about it. So I decided I would head her off at the pass. And I said, okay, Mom, I know I did this thing this way, I should have done it that way, and I've learned my lesson, and that should be the end of it, right? But it wasn't the end of it. My mom decided to get verbose in all this. She said, well, yeah, that's right, you did this thing wrong, and you should have done it that way. And then she went off into this really, really long lecture, and I thought I was avoiding the lecture by doing all that. And then finally, after she'd gone on for a few minutes, I said, geez, Mom, okay, I wasn't looking for a lecture. Now, one thing, my mom marches a little bit to a different beat, because she seemed really surprised. She said, oh, I thought you were looking for me to give you a lecture. What kid wants his parent to give him a lecture? I don't know why, that's what I thought you wanted. So she misread my intention. She thought I was telling her so that, hey, he wants to hear one of my Cracker Jack lectures evidently, and well, I don't want to disappoint here, so she let me have it. Misreading of intention. So when you make assumptions about language, assumptions about appearance, assumptions about intention, we can make mistakes that lead to friction and interaction. So the next time you're in such a situation, you're starting to get angry, at least take a few seconds and think, have I made an assumption? That is wrong. Now,
Mr. General Evaluator, fellow test masters, and of course Albert. Excellent topic that is relevant to all of us, something we can all relate to. I'm sure we've all made those kind of assumptions and sometimes had those kind of assumptions made about us. So that drew us in right away because it's so relevant to us. You told several stories with not only humor but lots of gestures and vocal variety. It was fun listening to your stories, and they all related well to the message and helped us understand what you were telling us by the stories. I think it's always helpful to have those kind of stories to convey the message rather than just talking about it. You could have said all those things about assumptions without telling stories, but I don't think it would have been as effective. As far as what you may want to work on or to challenge yourself, I'm not sure which this should fall under, but my one thought was that it could have been more effective to begin the speech with one of your stories. Maybe not one of those stories, but some story is always a good way to get people into the speech rather than just talking about why you're talking about it. Your quote about the link between you and me was amusing, but I have to admit that it took me a few seconds to process what you meant by that, and then I missed the next sentence. That is I was going to comment just because I can relate particularly to your story about the terminology in relation to industrial things. When I got my first job at a manufacturing company, I was very curious what in the world erection clips were. It was a long time before I had the nerve to ask anybody. I did not make an assumption about what they were. I did not come up during the time I had with other suggestions for you or comments, so excellent speech. I think we can all take it to heart and try to not make those kind of assumptions. Mr. General Evaluator.